Hello, welcome to today's program, Artificial Intelligence, Political Concerns in November 2024 and Beyond. I'm Dominique Lukey, and it's a pleasure to greet you. Artificial intelligence is exploding on the scene, showing promise for dramatic applications in healthcare, climate science, and automation, just to name a few. And yet there are concerns that AI applications are already posing a new threat to homeland security and politics. Now, given Wisconsin's battleground state status, these concerns call for heightened awareness in November 2024. Today's program features a conversation with Miles Taylor, a nationally recognized leader in artificial intelligence security and disinformation concerns. The program is moderated by the highly respected journalist, Rusty Cunningham. Rusty is the former editor of River Valley News, which includes the La Crosse Tribune, Winona Daily News, and Chippewa Herald. A big thank you to our program sponsors, Dave and Barb Scogan, Festival Foods, Joe and Pat Heim, Ann Bryce and Bill Haviland, Tom Houlihan, Suzanne Young, and Leader Ethics. Our program hosts are the La Crosse Tribune, the Winona Daily News, the Chippewa Herald, the La Crosse Area League of Women Voters, and Leader Ethics. Special acknowledgement goes to our co-hosts, Keep Our Republic. They have been active and diligent in Wisconsin, providing information on the importance of public awareness and integrity leading up to the 2024 election. And now I'd like to turn the program over to our moderator, Rusty Cunningham.
Thank you so much, Dominique, for that lovely introduction. We're blessed today to have Miles Taylor with us. Miles is a fascinating person, and he has a fascinating background. He served as a key official with the U.S. Department of Homeland Security. He's a cybersecurity expert who once worked for Google. He's an author and a driving force behind an initiative called Future U.S. He's very concerned about democracy and has become increasingly concerned about how artificial intelligence and disinformation can be misused to sway voters. Our program today was recorded earlier this morning, so I apologize that you won't be able to ask questions, but I'll do my best to try to anticipate what questions there may be, and we'll get responses from Miles. Before I get to my first question about why you started work for the government, Miles, I'll give you a few minutes to talk about your resume as well as your current work with Future U.S. Miles?
Well, it's great to be with you, friends, and thank you. And I actually was just looking down at my phone because there's some breaking news which we can get to that has to do with the subject we're discussing today. And I'll give you the teaser of it, and then we can go into the details. But, it looks like the U.S. government just disrupted a major Russian-backed AI-powered disinformation effort here in the United States. Looks like it's likely one of the more significant disruptions in this space that we've yet seen. So we'll get to that in a minute. But who am I and why am I here with you all today? The quick background is I've spent most of my career in the national security community and a lot of it working on technology policy. I came to Washington after 9/11 to really work in that national security community to prevent another day like that from happening again. And that journey took me from the office of the Speaker of the House to the Pentagon, to the White House, where I worked under Dick Cheney. And then I helped stand up the Department of Homeland Security when it was first created. And after that, spent a number of years on Capitol Hill, working on oversight committees related to national security. And then I went back into government again when Donald Trump was elected president and eventually became the chief of staff at the Department of Homeland Security. Some of you may know me not as Miles. Some of you may know me as Anonymous because I had a lot of misgivings, to say the least, about what I was witnessing inside the Trump administration and blew the whistle on the president first through an anonymous opinion piece in the New York Times about the instability inside the Trump administration. And then later unmasking myself during the 2020 election so I could talk very openly and in detail about the things that I had witnessed and my concerns. But make no mistake, I'm a political conservative. I came up that way in politics. And so my gripes with Donald Trump were more about his character than about the Republican Party at that point in time. But after leaving the administration, after coming out against Donald Trump, I returned to my career in national security and technology policy. I ran advanced technology and security strategy for Google, and then most recently helped start a new nonprofit here in the nation's capital called the Future US. And our focus is very simple. We're trying to be a crystal ball for America's policymakers to help them see the coming disruptions in technology so they can better anticipate what they need to do to protect the American people. And one of those issues that we've been educating policymakers on is our discussion today around artificial intelligence and the impact on democracy and elections. So I hope that sums it up for you all.
You got into government after 9/11. As I recall, you were not the only person so motivated, correct?
Well, look, I think a lot of people came into Washington after 9/11 to work not just in the national security community, but to serve their country. I mean, I think that was a very motivating event for a lot of millennials at the time. And you know, it was very visceral for me because 2 weeks before the attacks, I actually had been in the Twin Towers. I was visiting a family member in New York and had lunch up there at the top of the Twin Towers. And so watching those fall on the Today Show live felt so real, having just been there. And that really, frankly, it consumed my whole life after that, and was really focused on how I could direct my entire career towards not just preventing another day like that from happening again, but understanding those root causes. And I'm sure we'll get to this later, but in some ways there are a lot of parallels between what happened in that moment and some of the disruptions that we're trying to prepare for today in terms of nefarious uses of technology.
So as a journalist, let's go to the breaking news. Why don't you tell us about the threat that has now been unmasked and what it means to all of us?
Yeah, well, you know, I'm only just getting the initial tidbits, and I'm messaging with someone in the national security community right now that works in the Biden administration. But it looks like the U.S. Department of Justice, the FBI, and international law enforcement have disrupted a Russian-backed plot to use artificial intelligence to spin up lifelike social media personas to spread disinformation throughout the United States. And the initial reporting suggests close to 1,000 of these very authentic seeming AI social media accounts have been posing as Americans in recent months and posting across social media platforms and actually gaining some degree of traction. Now, I'll tell you, this is something that we have suspected all year, is that we would see foreign adversaries create much more convincing and interactive social media accounts that would try to inflame controversies in the United States, divide Americans, and subtly advance Russia's interests over America's interests. But this is really the most significant and public case I have seen in that regard. And it looks like a relatively sophisticated one. Now, a listener might be asking, well, why is this important? You know, we've seen plenty of stories about fake social media accounts run by foreign adversaries. Do people believe them? You know, often you can tell if they're fake because they are using broken English and it's not realistic. The concern here is, it seems from this reporting, that these are the far more sophisticated accounts that we expected to see, ones that are indistinguishable from real people because they're interactive and they post with, you know, very realistic and relevant information, and they socially engineer so that their disinformation gets picked up. And that has been made easier by LLMs, large language models, and AI-powered tools that are now commercially available. So it seems like this operation was run at the behest of the Kremlin, was run through Russia's public media outlet, in part Russia Today, and other actors within the country who tried to undermine the 2016 election. So this is the type of thing we're worried about. I would say it's good news, bad news. The good news, of course, is that this disruption happened. The bad news is This is the shot across the bow that shows these things are very possible, much easier to spin up, and much more likely to have impacts on our democracy than what we've seen in previous election cycles.
So why do foreign nations invest a lot of time and money in such disinformation?
Well, the answer is it saves them time and money. And what do I mean by that? If you can get the United States divided over something like the war in Ukraine, then if you are Russia, that benefits you, because if you can change US policy from actively opposing Russia's intervention in Ukraine to standing down, you save Russia time and money and Russian lives. So those types of operations our adversaries are undertaking to change how the United States acts in the world, to advance their interests over our own. Towards, in the middle of the Obama administration, there was an issue that largely united Republicans and Democrats, and that was that Russia and Vladimir Putin were our adversaries, that this was a country that was acting contrary to U.S. interests, that wanted to undermine America, and that had spent decades, frankly, since the Cold War, trying to largely undermine U.S. policy and damage U.S. trade, American prosperity, divide Americans. Russia was not our friend. If you fast forward in time to today, the American people are very divided about whether Russia is a friend or a foe. My former political party, the Republican Party, has a lot of folks in it in leadership positions that now think Vladimir Putin is our friend and we shouldn't be standing up to him in Eastern Europe. We should back down and let Putin do what he wants. I would argue that shift in U.S. policy in a lot of ways happened because of Russian disinformation here in the United States. The Russians have been very effective at spreading lies to Americans about whether or not to push back against autocratic regimes like the regime in Moscow, and it's benefited them by creating this debate in the United States about whether we should exert our influence, aid, trade, diplomacy, and force to try to resist the Russians. So that's why they do it, because it ends up being very beneficial to their interests. And what concerns me is the possibility that we end up indeed allying closer with our enemies than with our friends. And that's a very, very relevant moment to be having that conversation, because here, as I sit in Washington, D.C., leaders are arriving from NATO countries for a summit with the president to talk about exactly that. How does the West stay united as countries like Russia and China are actively trying to leverage emerging technology to damage our country, to steal American jobs, to steal American innovation, and to put the United States in a position of vulnerability from a national security standpoint?
Miles, I'm going to refer a few times to your recent bestseller, Blowback. One of the phrases you use in there, I would appreciate explanation. You use the phrase immature content that took time and planning. Now, to me, that seems oxymoronic. What do you mean by that phrase?
Look, and I think you mean it in the context of disinformation. Is that right? When you look at disinformation at its core, it's a term that has become, in some ways, unfortunately, politicized. It has nothing to do with Democrats or Republicans. Disinformation by design are lies or fabrications feeded into the public discourse and meant to look authentic and to create controversy or to misdirect people to lead them to other outcomes. If you go all the way back to the 2016 election, this was happening at a large scale in the United States at the behest of countries like Russia. They were creating fake social media accounts on places like Facebook and Twitter and pretending to be Americans and posting online to get people to argue with each other. In other words, they were taking both sides in controversies to inflame those controversies. So, one example, We saw Russian bot farms going out there and posting inflammatory things about the Black Lives Matter movement, and then going and creating fake accounts to create protests from people who allied with Black Lives Matter. They played the two sides against each other. And that wasn't just digital. People forget this manifested itself in real life. They planned events online, they planned rallies, they planned protests, and they encouraged both sides to go out there and fight with each other. And then there was media coverage. And so if you're sitting at home watching this in the United States, you're saying our country's more divided than ever. And you're picking a side and you're feeling more divided and not realizing that all of that started inside a Russian bot farm in Moscow with someone at their keyboard pretending to be an American. Now, I say that was immature content because if you go back and you look at some of those posts, like I said earlier, some of them were in broken English. They weren't believable. They were bad graphics. But it took, according to public reporting, hundreds of cyber warriors in Moscow to plan that operation to try to undermine the 2016 election. Hundreds of people. The thing that folks need to realize now is what was done in 2016 with hundreds of people and likely tens of millions of dollars, maybe more, spent by the Russians, can now be done by a handful of people anywhere. I could get a group of 10 folks together and run an operation very similar in size and scope to what the Russians did in 2016, but probably 10 times better quality just by using AI-powered tools that are now commercially available to anyone. Think about that. I can now run a nation-state level operation to undermine an American election as just a guy with a few friends, a couple of computers, and some relatively inexpensive AI tools. That has changed the game in terms of our cyber defenses in the United States. And this year, you will see that. Now, before I even saw this news story, that's what I was going to say today, is I was going to predict that at some point very soon, you would see efforts to try to disrupt our election. Now, I've been scooped by the news today because it just happened. But it's likely to happen in even more significant form between now and November. Our adversaries aren't going to stop just because they've been caught. And Americans need to be prepared for it. They need to be prepared for this type of disinformation to arrive in their inboxes. And I'll say one more thing about that before pausing, which is I want you to mentally compare it to spam. If you remember in the late 90s, as we all started to get our emails, you sort of believed the things that came in your email inbox, including if it was an email from a Nigerian prince saying, hey, if you'll just wire me $1,000, I can make you $10,000 and I'll wire you back. And in those early days of the internet, it was like, oh, wow, this is an incredible offer I'm getting. Well, in very short order, we learned that that was spam, that we were on the receiving end of a lot of junk email, just like we were on the receiving end of junk physical mail, snail mail. This is the new spam in your life is going to be things that look and seem very realistic, people that seem and look very realistic that aren't, that are AI-powered generated images and accounts trying to convince you of things that aren't true. The difference, of course, is that we don't have pattern recognition for that because most of us haven't been on the receiving end of those types of deep fake attacks, things that look and seem real. We need to get acclimated to that. We need to be skeptical because that will help us prevent those attacks from being successful this election.
One of the things that I truly enjoyed about your recent bestseller, Blowback, is that you use a number of provocative quotes from our nation's founders. This one is from Thomas Paine. An army of principles can penetrate where an army of soldiers cannot. Does AI threaten that?
This is a very, very difficult question. I will tell you personally, I would describe myself as a techno-optimist or a tech accelerationist. I feel very bullish about how artificial intelligence is going to help us protect lives, advance livelihoods, and protect our overall way of life. Specifically, what do I mean by that? We are going to see breakthroughs this year in cancer research to combat cancer, in ways to better invest our assets and our resources. and ways to advance manufacturing in the United States and bring jobs back to our country by making it more inexpensive to produce things here that we had previously outsourced. All kinds of extraordinary things are going to happen just this year in developments because of artificial intelligence. So I'm very optimistic about that. But I'm also realistic that, like any technological development, nefarious actors will try to use this for bad purposes. They already are, with the news that we talked about here moments ago about a foreign adversary using AI tools to try to divide our country, to polarize it further. But there's also going to be a lot darker ways that this happens. And there are things that I worry about in specific areas like synthetic biology. It has become much easier using artificial intelligence to understand how to manipulate things like pathogens, things that make you sick, and to manipulate those in ways that make pathogens more dangerous or more deadly, or perhaps targeted towards specific individuals or populations. Now, this sounds like the stuff out of science fiction, but it is going to become real here in the coming years. It will be available to everyday people, the ability to manipulate things of biological origin to create deadly effects. Now, this is the type of thing that we would assume for decades is only something that a major country can do. That the Chinese, for instance, or the Iranians might be researching biological weapons, but it would take tens of millions of dollars and tons of scientists to do that. Well, AI tools make it easier for you or I to look into how to create dangerous, novel pathogens on our own to infect people. And we're not far out from a world in which I can design something that could cause you harm, and that's directed just to you genetically, and that I could spread somewhere that I know you're going to be, and it won't infect other people, but it's designed to attach to you and your body and cause you harm without anyone ever knowing how that originated. That's very alarming. I think from a national security standpoint, we're really unprepared for that future. The good news, though, is if we're at the forefront of innovation, if we are the country in the lead investing in artificial intelligence and related technologies, we have a greater ability to anticipate what's coming, but also to defend against those nefarious use cases. Now, I know the reaction from a lot of people, rightfully, is we can't go into this future. We have to stop it. This sounds too dangerous. I would tell you to use a really common aphorism that the genie is out of the bottle. There's not a way to stop the developments in artificial intelligence. Even if the United States said, no more AI, we're too scared, the rest of the world will continue developing these technologies. So to go back to the Thomas Paine quote about how an army of principles can penetrate where an army of soldiers cannot, we need to be doing that technological development in a way that's governed by our values and to try to promote that throughout the world. In other words, developing AI tools that are safe, that are accountable, and that you can understand why they did what they did. And that requires really making sure that ethics are at the core of scientific development. And that's always been a principle here in America's innovation economy. We do have a lot of countries around the world that don't prioritize ethics in scientific research and development. So it's really important that the United States stays at the forefront because we can shape the development of these tools in ways that are consistent with our values.
As a security expert, you've discussed 4 elements of AI that we should be concerned about: hack and leak ops, manipulated media, bots inflaming controversies, you've talked a bit about that, and deep fakes to deceive voters. Could you please explain those 4 threats and what we should know about them?
Well, yeah. I mean, this election cycle, we already talked about one of them. It's clear that AI-powered bots pretending to be Americans are, underway at the moment and being used in previous election cycles. And I think the worry is they are easier to execute now with AI-powered tools. So let's take hack and leak operations, for instance. Everyone remembers, again, back in 2016, when an advisor to Hillary Clinton, John Podesta, had his email hacked by the Russians and had damaging emails leaked into the public domain that cast, the Clinton campaign in a bad light and cast the Democratic Party in a bad light and caused them, some damage in that election. Well, that attack was undertaken by a pretty simple cyber method called phishing. It's when someone emails you pretending to be someone else, get you to click on a link, and they infect your computer, they take over your computer. And in that case, they were able to snatch and grab and leak John Podesta's emails. Oftentimes, we've all been on the receiving end of phishing attempts. Again, those can seem very artificial. Someone says, hey, you've won a $200 gift certificate at Best Buy. Probably didn't win that gift certificate. I'm not going to click on that link. It's a lot easier now with AI-powered tools to do social manipulation to make you think I'm someone you know. So, maybe I send a social media footprint and it finds that you have 10 best friends and one of them is, named Johnny and he works in manufacturing. That AI-powered tool can quickly spin up an email address that looks like Johnny, that purports to have similar interests, that emails you and convincingly gets you to click on that link, maybe much more so than someone who's manually trying to reach those conclusions. Makes it easier to conduct that hack and leak operation. But of those different tactics, the one that does concern me the most, the one that we're going to be dealing with for many years to come, are deepfakes. It is the recreation of someone's likeness, my image, or my voice that seems very convincing to you. Now, it's now available to anyone who's watching me right now. You have the ability to go and create a deepfake of me that looks exactly like me and sounds exactly like me. You can do that right now. Now, what's harder for you to do at this very moment is to create a version of me that interacts with you in real time. So if you tried to do that, I would probably notice because there would be delays. Maybe the image would look grainy. But the technologists that work for our think tank, the Future US, are projecting that by this fall, we'll see enough development in these technologies that you should be able to create a real-time interactive deepfake of almost anyone. So I'll continue to use myself as the example. By this fall, you should be able to go take footage that's publicly available of me on television or speaking on radio programs or speaking on this program, feed it into an AI-powered system, and have it produce a bot that you can interact with in real time and have say whatever you want. You can have Miles Taylor saying inappropriate things or proposing illegal things, and it's totally interactive. And whoever you send the Miles Taylor bot to might not know that they're not actually interacting with me. So this is a very abstract picture I'm painting, but let me bring it into the present. Because the thing that we're worried about when it comes to the election is people using those tools to deceive voters about the time, manner, and place of voting. So again, I'll give you a specific example. If I wanted to upend this election, again, put politics out of it, Democrats, Republicans aside, if I wanted to upend this election and I'm a bad guy, I'm probably going to look at the swing states. I'm going to look at the places in the United States where that are most likely to influence something like the presidential election. And then within those swing states, I'm going to look at a population that tends to vote one way or the other. And I'm going to try to keep them from voting or encourage them to show out in bigger numbers. So let's pick Maricopa County, Arizona. Arizona is a big swing state in this election. Maricopa County is the fourth largest county in the United States. And I'm a bad guy. I may try to target women over the age of 65 in Maricopa County. Why? Women over the age of 65 tend to vote Democratic. They have one of the highest turnout rates in the country, and they tend to be less up on the latest developments in technology. So as a bad guy, what I could do is create a deepfake and create an interactive deepfake of poll workers in Maricopa County, Arizona, and have them make phone calls to those women over the age of 65 whose names I've pulled from the internet and say, hey, I just wanted to let you know there's been reports of gunmen at the polls today, but don't worry about it because the governor has extended voting to tomorrow. Oh, gee whiz, there's gunmen at the polls? Yeah, there's gunmen. It's dangerous, but the police are going to take care of it. Just don't go vote today. Tell your friends and family to stay home. Okay, thank you. I appreciate the phone call. That person hangs up. They have no idea the entire time they were interacting with a bot and not a real person because it sounded like a real person. It sounded like someone they knew. and that bot interacted with them with information that validated that they were real about maybe where their polling place was or the time of voting, and gives them that false piece of information that voting's delayed until tomorrow, which is not true. Your governor has no authority to delay voting until the next day. That could potentially, if I targeted towards 1,000 women over the age of 65 in Maricopa County in Arizona, it could change the election. It could potentially upend that vote by taking a critical part of the electorate and keeping them from voting that day. We actually produced an advertisement portraying exactly that scenario, a public service announcement that we promoted around the country to make people aware of the fact that this would be possible. And we produced that whole advertisement using completely deep-faked AI voices. This is doable. This is real. And what we want to try to do is sound the alarm around the country in advance of the election that these tactics might be used by bad actors in the lead up to election day to try to sway the vote one direction or the other. So that's an example of the concern.
Whenever there are bad actors, there are calls for government regulation. University of Maryland's program for public consultation has surveyed 3,610 voters about the need to govern AI. The survey found very large bipartisan majorities favor giving the federal government broad powers to regulate artificial intelligence. They endorsed 7 proposals currently under consideration in Congress, and the executive branch for regulating AI-generated deepfakes in elections and beyond, and AI making decisions with the potential for harm. According to the survey, there is broad bipartisan support for prohibiting deepfake depictions in campaign advertising. That's 84% nationally, and it breaks down to 83% Republican, 86% Democrat. So clearly, pretty unified. Should our government act to curb the influence of AI?
Look, I think government regulation plays a really important role when it comes to artificial intelligence. But we have to be really specific about this, because calls to just ban AI or regulate AI aren't even a coherent way of thinking about the problem. That would be like me saying, well, water can keep people alive, but water can also kill people. We have to just regulate water. That's not how we think about it in this country. We regulate things like water processing facilities. We regulate things like maritime security. We don't just say we're regulating water and forbidding it. And AI is exactly like that. It's the new water of the digital age. And you're not going to say, well, we'll just ban water. You go to the sectors where it's being used and you act smartly in those sectors. So what you're likely to see in the coming years is the different parts of our society where artificial intelligence is going to be applied, which, by the way, is every part of our society, being regulated largely using the existing mechanisms that regulate those sectors. So I'll give you an example: critical infrastructure. Around this country, we have programs and policies in place to protect things like chemical facilities that produce dangerous chemicals that are used in manufacturing. There are regulations on the books about how those facilities need to protect themselves so that terrorists, for instance, don't breach the gates of a sensitive chemical plant and detonate it and cause harm to the local community. Those existing regulatory structures will be what's used to regulate the impact of artificial intelligence on those facilities. So, for instance, the chemical security regulations might be updated to say, the cybersecurity at that plant must have protections in place to prevent AI-powered tools from being able to breach the digital perimeter. Or it might say that those facilities need to invest in making sure that the facial recognition, at the front gates can't be deep-faked by someone pretending to be, one of the operators of that facility. So those specific sectors will end up adapting to the age of artificial intelligence. But what's really important from my view is that we have to be careful not to overregulate ourselves away from the upsides so that we can stay competitive with other countries around the globe and engage in these advances. And I'll give you sort of a silly example, but one that's manifested in reality. Because of the immediate concern around AI, and you cited the poll numbers, a lot of Americans are worried about the application of AI. The Biden administration passed an executive order on artificial intelligence to start to put some guardrails around the technology. It was a good instinct. It was the right thing to do. But even people I know in the Biden White House have said, we got some pieces of it wrong. So for instance, and I'll simplify this, there were parts of that executive order that said, well, if agencies are going to use AI, they have to go through a transparent public process before they go purchase AI tools. Now, the consequence of that has been if an agency like, let's call it the Postal Service, wants to upgrade their email system because Microsoft is introducing AI tools into all of their email systems, before they just hit that upgrade button to better, faster email to allow the Postal Service to operate better. Well, now, previously, they hit the upgrade button and they just bought the new subscription. Now, they might have to go through an onerous, multi-month notice and comment process where they announce that they're going to press the upgrade button and spend the money. They give you a chance as the public to come out and comment on it. In the meantime, you at home have already upgraded your Microsoft to a better, faster, AI-powered, secure email system. Those are the types of things that we want to avoid, those unforced errors where we slow down instead of speed up the pace of innovation in government. So we want to make sure we keep the guardrails on and keep it safe, but we don't want to put in place too many restrictions that we make it difficult to advance to the future. And that's actually one of the things that I'll be talking about later today. I've got some appointments, and then later today I'm going to be here in Washington having conversations with NATO leaders and people from NATO countries about how we can take advantage of these rapid breakneck advances in artificial intelligence without introducing new vulnerabilities into the West.
Fascinating. A CBS News investigation found that ChatGPT gave incorrect or incomplete answers to some questions about how to vote in battleground states ahead of the upcoming U.S. presidential election. Are there any lessons that we can learn from that?
Sure. I mean, I think, at the end of the day, the lesson here is, and I'm going to sound like a kindergarten teacher, but this is going to become more and more relevant than you realize. You have to check your sources. Don't just trust anything that ChatGPT says, but we've been saying this for 15 years. Don't just trust anything you see on the internet. If it seems unusual, go double check what the source is and go to those original facts. Now, again, that's going to sound boring to you, but I'm going to give an example where this will impact your personal life every single day. Let's say you get a phone call and it's your daughter and she's calling from the county jail and she says, they pulled me over leaving the party and I've been drinking. Mom, they've got me in here in jail. I need to get out on bail. They need $1,000, but I can't transfer any money from here. You're my one phone call. Can you transfer $1,000 to the bail bondsman to get me out of here? Your daughter's crying. She's in panic. Of course you're going to do that. Of course you're going to jot down that routing number from your daughter and transfer the $1,000 to get her out of jail and go pick her up at the county jail. You show up at the county jail. Your daughter's not there. You go to the front desk. There's no one with that name in the county jail. Well, what happened? You got a deep fake phone call of your daughter. This is easy to do. I could do it to you today. I could create that deep fake. And indeed, things like that are happening today. So what do I mean by check your sources? Well, in that phone call, did you think for a second to say, hey, honey, where did we go on vacation when you were 12? That international stop, the first place you ever went internationally. Well, if you thought to ask that, the bot wouldn't have had the answer. If it was your real daughter, she'd say, it was Italy. It was the best vacation we ever went on. We went to Italy. You checked your sources. You made sure this was your daughter. That sounds silly, but the best experts on deepfakes in the country, some of whom I'll see later today, are talking about in the interim period, we're probably going to revert to real passphrases to make sure that the phone calls we're getting are from real people. You might say to your husband or wife, look, our passphrase is Naples because we had our honeymoon down in Naples, Florida, so that you can make sure if you get that phone call about transferring money or signing a contract or an emergency, you can just double check that that's the person who they say they are. Now, this is happening at extraordinary scale. There was a story just a few months ago of a major company that transferred $25 million to what they thought was a client because it was a deep fake phone call purporting to be that client. It happened. They lost the money. These things are happening with banks every single day. Banks getting phone calls from what they think are customers and making transfers between accounts. But this could also happen in other ways in your life that we're seeing out there as we speak, which is you've got people who are receiving deepfake videos of their spouse potentially engaging in infidelity. Imagine right now if that landed in your inbox. Forget all the politics and policy we're talking about right now. Imagine someone very important in your life and you get that email on your phone and it's great cell phone footage or audio, and it sounds like they're engaged in an unfaithful situation, engaged with someone else, they're cheating on you. This would upend your day. It would upend your life. And I suspect that the majority of people listening right now have no way to determine whether that was real or fake. And in fact, unfortunately, I suspect a lot of us, to protect ourselves, would default into thinking this is real. Because of course my spouse is going to say, that's not real, that wasn't me, that never happened. You say, well, I have the proof. And all along, it might have been a deep fake. So how are you going to start to prepare yourself for that future? That is a big question that we're discussing here in Washington, of course, discussing around the country is how do you prepare for that future? And I don't want to be all doom and gloom, and I'm sure we'll get to this, but there are actually some very good technical answers and solutions that we're on the cusp of.
You are preaching to the choir. My journalism school, the University of Nebraska, used to preach that if your mother says she loves you, you should get a second source. So I think having that healthy skepticism is incredibly important. Now, we're talking about something that I think is crucial. One of the consequences for any bad actors would be that these deepfakes just not work. And they not work because people arm themselves through skepticism, through checking the source. Is this true? Is this not true? And in fact, AI could be used to detect some of those deep fakes. How can voters use AI to their advantage?
It's a great question. Well, I'll tell you, look, this is how certain I am that absent wider public awareness, these tools will be effective. And I'll tell you why. We briefed all of the departments and agencies that are responsible for protecting your elections. We briefed a year ago the FBI and the Department of Homeland Security and the White House on some of these scenarios I sketched out that we at the Future US were very concerned about and that we wanted the government to start preparing for. And while we were doing some of these briefings, we ran an exercise. And in some of these PowerPoint presentations, we talked to law enforcement officials about a case in Northwest Indiana, in a town that I grew up in, LaPorte, Indiana, about a young man who released a deep fake video of a naked man streaking into the high school. And there was a basketball game happening. And this video, this little clip of someone running into the high school on security cam footage went viral and resulted in the game getting evacuated, people rushing out of the building, not sure what this guy was doing, running around in there. And that was dangerous. And the local SWAT team went and found this kid, broke down his door, arrested him for distributing this deep fake. And, it's the digital equivalent of shouting fire in a crowded theater. And it led to a lot of controversy. Is what this kid did illegal, or did the police go too far? And so we showed the security camera footage, we showed the headlines, and we got these law enforcement officials to start debating. And they took sides. Some of them said that the kid, while it was a bad error in judgment, had not broken the law, and that the police went too far in sending the SWAT team to knock down his door. And others took a very, very strong stance and said what this kid did is tantamount to shouting fire in a crowded theater. And yes, he should have been arrested. At the end of our presentation, we revealed to the law enforcement official that the footage that we showed them, the headlines we showed them, the whole controversy was fake. None of this had ever happened. The story didn't happen in Northwest Indiana. The footage wasn't real. None of it was real. And yet we got them, the top election security officials in the United States, to take a position, to take a strong emotional position about a fake controversy. I tell you that story because if the people responsible for protecting you against deepfake attacks can't tell the difference between what's real and what's fake, you certainly are likely to fall victim to those attacks unless you have that healthy degree of skepticism, unless you expect that this might happen to you and you go check your sources. So, to that end, I mentioned some of the technical solutions. I'll tell you what will solve this in the long run. And I am optimistic about this. In the not too distant future, your iPhone, your cell phone, by default, when you take a picture, is likely to have a cryptographic signal that was taken at this date, place, and time, and I've not been manipulated. And it will be impossible for someone to change that cryptographic signature and that ledger. So forever, you'll know if it shows up, your phone will essentially have a handshake with a photo someone sends it that says, yep, that's a real photo taken at that time, date, and place. Or it will say, hey, red alert, it looks like this photo has been manipulated. We are moving towards those standards in the technology sector. Eventually, those handshakes will happen digitally behind the scenes all the time between what's real and what's fake, and you'll have that built-in protection. That doesn't yet exist today. So we're in that moment where those standards don't exist, those regulations and policies don't exist, and we have to protect ourselves by raising awareness, having a healthy degree of skepticism, and checking our sources. And that's really relevant this election cycle when it comes to bad guys trying to use these deepfakes to deceive folks. We really need to make people aware of the fact that that's going to happen so they can take those steps just to double check that something is true or not.
Wisconsin obviously is a battleground state, and there's concern about the security of election workers. Is that something that we should be concerned about?
Well, I think so. And if you ask the election workers themselves, they would say so. In fact, a relatively recent poll showed that more than 1 in 3 election workers in the United States are concerned about their physical safety. Now, this is really shocking to me. I'm quite certain that if we asked that question something like, 10 years ago, we wouldn't see nearly that many election workers say that they're worried about their physical safety simply for going and helping to manage the polls and check people in to exercise their democratic right. But people are really worried now at the polls because we are in such a polarizing moment in our politics where election officials have been demonized. They've been seen as, people who are trying to put their thumb on the scales or are stuffing ballot boxes, things that are unproven, things that are not true. And it's meant that 2 things are a concern. One is that, of course, these people are worried about their safety, and they shouldn't be. And there's a culture of fear and intimidation around the polls. We've really got to nip that in the bud. It shouldn't be scary to go vote. But 2, what we're seeing this election cycle is that a lot of poll workers who are experienced poll workers from previous cycles have decided simply not to do it again this year, which means we have a lot more untested people who are going to work the polls on election day. Now, states like Wisconsin and localities in Wisconsin are doing a really good job in making sure that those new poll workers are trained to do their work. But we don't want this to keep happening in future cycles where you have people who are untrained, untested, going and working the polls, because it will diminish public confidence in the integrity of the voting process. So this is something that, regardless of whether you're a Democrat or a Republican, we have to speak out forcefully against. We cannot allow our election officials to be intimidated, to be taunted, to be harassed. And we saw that in 2020, and it's not okay. And it's one of the few areas where I think, as Democrats and Republicans, it should be very easy to come together to push back forcefully against anyone who would try to embrace or endorse the harassment of our election officials. They're doing a public service. They are doing it with appropriate oversight. I have a great degree of confidence that our elections are going to be carried out in a way that is legitimate and secure, whether you're in a red state or a blue state. I have a lot of confidence in that. What I don't have a lot of confidence in is that people are going to be responsible about spreading that message. We need to reinforce the fact that the vote will be free and fair rather than spreading perceptions that people are trying to manipulate it. There's no evidence of folks trying to manipulate the physical ballot. I do think we need to be worried about, though, again, foreign adversaries and others trying to create the perception that these are not free and fair elections.
Miles, you talk about the need to strengthen the guardrails of democracy. One of the key initiatives that our leader ethics group has pushed in Wisconsin for a couple of years is Final Five voting or ranked choice voting. I know that's a concept that's on your radar. It's a way to make democracy more competitive and less controlled by the two parties. You write that the greatest threat to democracy will come from within. Please tell us why you think ranked choice or Final Five voting could help strengthen democracy.
Well, look, I think we need to be open as a country to political reforms and democratic reforms. And I'll pick on one area in particular that a lot of people call the primary problem, which is the primary process itself. We all know that our country has gotten more polarized, and what has not helped are closed primaries in the United States. Now, what do I mean by closed primaries? If you're not familiar with the term, what that means is over the years, a lot of states around our country have made it so that you can't go vote in the primaries. For a lot of folks, that's in the spring or the summer. Can't go vote in the primaries unless you're a part of that political party. So if there's a Republican primary for the Republicans to decide who they're going to nominate as their candidate for Congress, you can't participate in that unless you're registered as a Republican. Now, on the surface, that sort of seems fair. Well, if I'm not in that club, then maybe I shouldn't pick who's on the ballot in that club. But let me tell you what the consequence has been from closed primaries. Typically, not a lot of folks go vote in closed primaries unless they are very, very fervent supporters in that political party. So what ends up happening, whether it's Republican or Democratic primaries, is you have the most ideological, the most fervent voters going into the primaries and voting for the candidate that tends to be the most extreme representative of their views. And then the rest of us, the 90% of us who don't participate in that process, because it's usually around 10%, maybe at best, of the country participates in the primary process. Well, then the other 90% of us get to the polls in November and we see a Democratic candidate who's far, far left, a Republican candidate who's far, far to the right, and we think neither of these people represents my viewpoint. Well, if we want to fix that problem, it's already too late. It started in the primary process. But if you want a more diverse set of voices in deciding who gets picked in the primaries, you can't have those primaries be closed. And I'll give you an example where this is really frustrating to a lot of people in a lot of states, which is our military service members. A lot of folks that serve in our military don't register with one party or another. And they come back from serving overseas and they want to participate in our democracy. They want to help decide who's on the ballot in November. And because they're an independent voter, they get punished. They don't get to go vote in the Democratic primary or the Republican primary. They don't get to decide who's on that ballot. They just have to show up with two very bad options and make a decision. And so there is a movement underway in this country to the primary process. Democrats, Republicans, or independents to go engage in the democratic process and decide who should be on the ballot. And in the places where this has happened, it's actually had a really extraordinary effect, is voters end up choosing the more mainstream candidates to go on the ballot in November, the candidates that actually represent a wider swath of views than just the extreme vocal minority of one party or another. The result, places that have implemented those reforms tend to elect more unifying leaders, whether they're from the center right, the center left, people that more of us can agree on. So that's one reform I think really worth looking at. And the other you mentioned is ranked choice voting, which is basically just a process where you go and instead of just picking one of several candidates, you rate them 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then what happens at the end of the process is those votes get added up depending on how you ranked a candidate. And the person with the most votes ends up winning in that process. So the most unifying candidate wins. And I'll give you an example of that. If you have a really extreme candidate, they may get some number ones in the process, but only from 10% of the most extreme voters. The rest of people might give them a 4 or a 5 because they look too extreme. And the person who gets that average of the most, numbers ends up being usually a more ideologically centrist candidate, one that represents the moderate majority of Americans. So that's a democratic reform that a number of states have undertaken, like Alaska, and it's had really interesting effects where I think a lot of the voters would say that they are getting leaders that are more representative of their views. Now, there's a basket of other democracy reforms out there that are worth looking at, but we can't pretend that our system has to stay exactly as it's always been. I mean, our system was designed to be able to be edited, to evolve with the times. And as our countries become more polarized and more partisan, I think we should be really open to these reforms that increase choice and competition. We're a free society. We shouldn't be scared of choice and competition. But one of the few places that we don't have it, ironically, is in our democracy. And we all know it. We all know we end up standing there looking at that ballot in November saying, oh man, I don't really like these choices. And it's a sign that our process has lost its competitive edge. So I think those are all things worth looking at.
Terrific. As we wrap up today, I'd like you to share a story, and it's an insightful story that you provide in your book that involves a mentor, General John Kelly. You worked with him when he was Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security. When he was quickly reassigned, he gave you something from his office and some words of, I'll say, leadership. Would you mind sharing?
Yeah, well, Kelly was one of the best bosses I've ever had. For folks who don't know him, 4-star Marine general who was the head of U.S. Southern Command. He got picked by Donald Trump to be his Secretary of Homeland Security, and then became White House Chief of Staff to Donald Trump. And my former boss was very public in his break with Donald Trump, was very alarmed by what he saw day to day in working with that man. And but outside of all of the frenzied chaos inside the Trump administration, there were moments of levity. And one of those moments for me was, you have these meetings with international figures when you're in one of those senior positions. And John Kelly, when he was Secretary of Homeland Security, had a meeting with a European leader, and they often exchange gifts. And so, you'll give them a plaque or a statue, and they'll give you something back from their home country. And in one of those gift exchanges, one of these leaders had given General Kelly, before he went over to the White House, he was Secretary of Homeland Security, had given him a pair of wacky socks. So, we've all seen these. A lot of you probably have them. Funny cartoonish socks that you can wear to spice up your business attire. And as he was packing up to go to the White House to go be Chief of Staff, he had very few belongings he brought into the office. And that was something that he taught me. He said, when you're in government, don't act like you're permanent here. Don't bring all of your trophies and effects and plaques and put them up in the office, because you may not be here for long. And so he had very, very few things on his desk. And he had this pair of wacky socks. And I'm sitting there, frankly, pretty despondent that he's decided to go to the White House. I loved working with Kelly, and I was really worried about what was going on in the White House at the time. And he tried to cheer me up. He threw me this pair of wacky socks and said something to the effect of, when push comes to shove, when things get really difficult, when you're in a moment of moral crisis, don't get cold feet. He threw these over to me, and it was just sort of a funny moment. Much, much later, after I'd quit the Trump administration in protest, after I had decided to really put my home, my job, my life, my financial security at risk by doing what I thought was right, to go out and talk about some of the more alarming things I'd witnessed. I was going through my things in my apartment, and I found this pair of socks and thought about Kelly's exhortation in a moment of consequence to not get cold feet. And I would say to folks listening right now, and I'm going to put my kindergarten teacher hat back on, that the price of dissent right now in this country is very, very high. And when I talk to student groups, I talk about this all the time, that it's really costly to speak up in this moment. And I mean, in your community, and you know this, if you're a business leader, if you're a teacher, you go out and you express an opinion about what's happening in our political system, you're worried, because you're worried about someone forcefully shouting you down. You're worried about getting canceled in your community. And the consequence of that is It's become costly to speak out in this country. And I compare it when I talk to student groups to the law of supply and demand in economics. We all remember those supply and demand curves. And basically what we learn is very high in a marketplace, right? When the price, to lower the price, to lower that cost, you can either decrease the demand. And when it comes to speaking out, we don't want to decrease the demand. All right. We don't want to demand less truth and less honesty and less candor. So what does economics teach us? There's only one other way to lower the price of dissent, to lower the price of speaking out. And that is to increase the supply. It would be that way with pencils. If pencils went to $5 a pencil, the only way to lower that price is to flood the marketplace with more pencils. And it's the same thing when it comes to the truth right now. The only way to make it less costly to tell the truth is to increase the supply, is to be unafraid, to be unintimidated, to be not worried about being canceled by going out there and speaking the truth. And I think that's really important in this environment. And it was something that my boss, General Kelly, taught me by example. And it's something that I learned the hard way by keeping myself masked, by keeping myself and my opinions anonymous. And I realized that it was very important to come forward in my own name, because that would make it easier for the next person and the next person and the next person to tell the truth. So I would leave you with that today. We've never been in a moment where that is more important for Americans writ large to realize and to show by example.
Wonderful message to end with, Miles. We greatly appreciate your time, your expertise, and insight today. Thank you so much.
Thank you, my friends.
To wrap up today, it's my honor now to introduce the founder and executive director of Leader Ethics, Lee Rosh.
Well, I want to thank Miles and Rusty again for this program. The words that come to mind to me are engaging, important, and thoughtful. And those are the things that I think we need as citizens to be bringing forward as we look at this upcoming election and all of the topics that we covered today regarding the advances in technology. I also want to thank the members of the media and lacrosse area or organizations that form the coalition Community for their support, as well as Keep Our Republic, a non-profit organization that is really focusing on election integrity in the key states of Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin. Our next program will be on August 5th. It will be an in-person program in Madison, Wisconsin, at the Madison College Goodman campus. The title of the program is Safe and Secure Elections in Turbulent Times. Our speakers are David Haynes, the former editor with the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel, and former Wisconsin Governor Scott McCollum. And they are the co-founders of an organization called WISACT. WISACT is a cross-partisan network promoting truth in politics, peaceful engagement with American citizens, and the support for the electoral process. And they're going to be sharing their plans and actions in advance of the November 2024 election. Without question, November 2024 has elements that are layered, and they are without precedent. And so I hope you will consider, if you're in the Madison area attending this program, it's really going to be an opportunity for you to see something. Again, I want to thank our speakers and all the members of the audience. Best wishes for a wonderful day. Thank you.